Hey there. This is the Dorky, Geeky, Nerdy Trivia Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Rollins. This is our first regular episode of Season 2, and to celebrate the new game's release, we're heading into the Final Fantasy series. If you're new here, don't worry, you can jump in at any point, though there's 57 other episodes of Geeky Trivia for you to check out at dorkygeekynerdy.com. Since last week's intro was so long, let's just dive right into this week's episode. The Dorky Round. Number 1. What name was it originally conceived under? Fighting Fantasy. Number 2. Which was the first Final Fantasy released on a non-Nintendo system? Final Fantasy VII. It was released for the PlayStation 1. Number 3. What is the name used by all of the various engineers in the series? Sid. Number 4. What is the name of the race with pom-poms on their heads who are sometimes playable and sometimes allow players to change their names? Moogles. Number 5. What is the name of the race of birds which served the same role as horses did in medieval times? Chocobos. Number 6. In the first game, what is the most powerful black magic? Flare. Number 7. In the first game, what is the most powerful white magic? Holy. Number 8. Which Final Fantasy VII character is known for a giant sword and spiky hair? Cloud Strife. Number 9. What was Zidane Tribal's distinguishing physical feature in Final Fantasy IX? He had a tail. Number 10. Which Star Wars characters inspired the names of minor characters in several Final Fantasy games? Biggs Darklighter and Wedge Antilles. The Geeky Round. Number 1. Who is the creator of the franchise? Hironobu Sakaguchi. Number 2. Who was the composer of the first several games? Nobu Uematsu. Number 3. Which Japanese game was released in North America as Final Fantasy II? Final Fantasy IV Easy Type. In Japan, Final Fantasy IV was released in 2 difficulty levels. In Japan, Final Fantasy IV was released in 2 difficulty levels, and North America got the easy one, with less EXP per character level and universal status healing items available from the start. Number 4. Which was the first game released in North America as a Final Fantasy title, but was released in Japan as part of another franchise? Final Fantasy Adventure. In Japan, it was Adventure of Mana, but in America, Sega had exclusive rights to the Mana games, and Nintendo had the only portable system on the market, so the title was branded as Final Fantasy. Number 5. Which platform's Final Fantasy games are no longer considered members of the franchise? Game Boy. Final Fantasy Adventure became Adventure of Mana and launched the Mana franchise, while Final Fantasy Legend was part of the Seiken Densetsu brand. Number 6. Which Final Fantasy game was intended as an entry-level RPG that could be played in a single afternoon? Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, aka Final Fantasy USA. Number 7. Which game introduced the first playable collector's card game? Final Fantasy VIII. Number 8. Who designed many of the characters for the early part of the series? Yoshitaku Amano. Number 9. What was the first Final Fantasy MMO? Final Fantasy XI. Number 10. Which character famously declared, "You spoony bard"? Tella in Final Fantasy IV. The Nerdy Round. Number 1. Which was the first game in the series to name the characters controlled by the player? Final Fantasy II. Number 2. Which was the first game in the series to have a world map-altering cataclysm partway through the story? Final Fantasy II. Number 3. What is the name of the one character who actually travels from game to game? Gilgamesh. Number 4. Which was the first game to eliminate character levels as an upgrade mechanism? Final Fantasy II. Number 5. Which was the first game that allowed you to change character classes by, essentially, treating a character as a member of the intended class? Final Fantasy II. Number 6. Which was the earliest Final Fantasy to get a direct sequel? Final Fantasy VII. Number 7. Which main series Final Fantasy game is actually a sequel to Final Fantasy Tactics? Final Fantasy XII. Number 8. Which game's Japanese release included a programmer's room that was removed from the North American release? Final Fantasy IV. Number 9. Which game first introduced us to Chocobos? Final Fantasy II. Number 10. Whose grave can be found in the original release of the first Final Fantasy? Erdrick, a major character in the Dragon Warrior Dragon Quest series. In re-releases made after the Square Enix merger, the grave belongs to Link. Everyone accounted for? Good. We have other video game episodes, including The Legend of Zelda, if you're interested. We'll be back next week with another chance to test your brain. Here's the clue. What branch of mathematics gets its name from the Greek words for measurement and earth? We'll see you here next week. In the meantime, be sure to visit our sponsor page at dorkygeekynerdy.com/sponsors. It helps keep the monsters at bay and the torches lit. This has been the Dorky, Geeky, Nerdy Trivia Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Rollins. Thanks for listening.